Recording. Okay, so I think we can start. So we waited a few minutes so late people could arrive as well. So today, of course, we're not going to talk about arrays. We talked about arrays on Monday, okay? But we are going to see the other important type, two types of the values. Remember, the values, not the variables that you can have in JavaScript. So one is array, and we saw it last time, okay? All the story, how to create, how to use, and so on. But today, we're going to talk about objects and then functions, okay? We'll come back to functions also later on because they are very, very important in JavaScript, okay? And then this is the first part of this morning, okay? Second part, we play a little bit with some code, okay? Even in the first part, but in the first part, just maybe one test, two tests with the Python tutor, that didactic tool that I showed you last time, okay? So let's start with objects, okay? Well, objects are very peculiar in JavaScript, okay? Object in JavaScript may exist without classes, okay? Maybe you already learned a lot about object-oriented programming, and you think there's a template which is typically called class, okay? And then from that class, like, you can create instances, so copies of that template that are independent and they can assume their values and so on. This is not the way in JavaScript. So objects basically exist without classes. So they are sort of just a collection of properties, okay, that have a unique identifier, but each one of the objects is independent from the other objects. I must tell you immediately that we are not going to see how you can do object-oriented programming in JavaScript in the, let's say, traditional sense of object-oriented programming. So emulating something like classes, having inheritance and all these kind of things. We are not going to cover this because for one thing it's not really needed in our course, and the other is maybe it's not so useful in JavaScript as well because there are so many ways you can circumvent this approach. So maybe it's not worth having a look. But I mean, there are JavaScript evolved in a way that let's say sort of object-oriented programming styles that can be emulated. Okay, so if you're really big fan of object-oriented programming, you can go by yourself and learn a little bit how you can sort of emulate this behavior in JavaScript. Okay, in modern JavaScript. So we are going to see traditional Java objects. So objects are just created directly without deriving it from a template, which we also name it class as in traditional object-oriented programming. And objects are also dynamic, differently from traditional object-oriented programming. So you can add and remove properties. We say methods means functions and so on in the object. Okay? So you may add, delete, redefine, and so on, okay? There are no access control methods, so everything is public. You remember maybe in some object-oriented programming you can define some properties private so that nobody outside the object can touch them. It's not like, JavaScript is not like this. Everything is public, okay? You can sort of emulate again, but we are not going to cover it unless it's really needed for our purposes. And this is really peculiar of JavaScript. There is no real difference between properties and methods because methods are just functions and functions are objects. So it's like assigning another object to a property. Okay, we will see it a lot during this course. Okay, so let's start with objects. So, sorry, just to conclude, we call them methods because we know the property references a function, just because we are used to this kind of terminology, but there's no real difference, okay? Okay, so object is just an unordered collection of properties, okay? So a set of properties with some values, even uninitialized, so they have undefined. You remember last time we said undefined if you didn't initialize the value yet. Each property has a name, which is called the key, and the value. And you store and retrieve property values through the property names, as you would expect. Object creation is very easy. It's sort of similar to Python, okay? So you use the curly bracket, you define an object, okay? And you need to give names to the properties, which are the keys, which must be unique because they are the way in which you access the content, the values, and a value if you wish, okay? Value can be any valid value in JavaScript, so any of the values that we saw last time, okay? So numbers, strings, Boolean, null, and undefined, okay? Plus any reference to any valid object in JavaScript. That means user-created objects, arrays, or functions, okay? Okay, so very simple syntax. You can use the keys without the quotation marks, okay, or with the quotation marks. It's more or less the same unless you really have special cases, but I mean, suggest not to use them. So there are keys you cannot express, you cannot use them, you know, because, for instance, there are spaces or special characters and so on, and you need to enclose it in quotes, okay? But I would say, I mean, this is just very peculiar cases that we try to avoid just for simplicity because we are deciding the name of the properties and we try not to overcomplicate things, okay? So, you see that this is the view of the Python tutor, okay? So you see that what you have here, point, book, and so on, are variables. They have a reference, which is this arrow, to something in the memory that is stored somewhere that is the object, that has a list of keys and values, okay? I'm not going to try all the examples, but maybe the most interesting ones we are going to give it a try in Python tutor. Okay, so I think we said everything here. Just remember that we can add properties after object creation, and we can also delete them. It's a bit less common, okay, because typically we don't delete anything. Oh, by the way, how things disappear from the memory in JavaScript, I mean, it's not in the slide, it's just a curiosity. I mean, that's a garbage collector, as in many other languages. It's an interpreted language, so the interpreter always knows if you still have a reference or not to the content and the variables and the values and so on, okay? So, I mean, of course, we don't delete anything, but think unless it's really needed, but think of where JavaScript was born. It was born in the context of web pages, right? So when you leave the web page, the browser destroys everything. So there's not really so much need to delete content from the memory, okay? It's not a program that is supposed to last so much, okay? So the operating system or the environment takes care of freeing all the memory that is being used. Okay, accessing properties, you already saw the notation, dot, okay, or the square brackets. Okay, so you define an object, a number of keys or properties, a number of values. That can be also referenced to other type of objects, including arrays. Okay, and then you can use just a dot to access it, I mean, as in many other programming languages, or the square brackets. Okay. Just be careful with the square brackets. You are expected to have an expression, a JavaScript expression inside the brackets. So if it's a name of the property, it must be a string, or a variable containing a string that is actually the name of the property. Okay, like here, my title with a space. Where, of course, with this syntax, you cannot use the dot because otherwise the parser, JavaScript parser gets confused. Okay. Okay, so yes, I think that's all here. So objects, in short, for us, could even be thought as associative arrays. Okay, what's an associative array? It's an array in which you can use anything you like as an index. Okay, not really an index, a numeric index, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but you can put anything. Okay, it's very common in other programming languages as well. Okay, sometimes with the library, sometimes provided by the language, and so on. Okay, So it's also a way to store information where you have key value pairs, okay, in short. Okay. Deleting properties is a keyword specialized for this purpose, but again, unless it's really needed, we don't care. Okay. JavaScript is very flexible in its syntax. We will always see all these kind of idioms that can be used in JavaScript because, I mean, it's not like we really like those idioms, but sometimes it's easier to write JavaScript in this way, and also you find it around in all the places, okay? Even, you know, the AI tools and so on use it. So we need to be able at least to understand it. So we can even create properties with this syntax using the squared brackets on the left side, okay, or the colon. Just putting an expression here on the left, and it's very convenient when we have the name of the property we want to create into a variable, okay, like here, square bracket prop, colon with a value, okay? Otherwise it would be quite difficult, right, to add it. We would need basically a method of the object in JavaScript, otherwise we cannot do it, okay? You can even use expressions, but try to avoid them because it makes the code much less readable, okay? I mean, this is basically should be evaluated as a string or a number, and of course expressions are valid, but I mean, try to avoid it. Just be aware of the difference between if you use, you see the quotes, it means you are searching for the property name title. If you don't use it, you are using the string that contains the name of the property that is contained inside the title, which is the variable, okay? But I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Just make sure that when a property is not defined, you don't run into runtime errors, okay? Because, of course, you cannot access properties when the object is not defined, okay? It's like a null pointer exception in Java or even in Python. I don't remember how it's called in Python anyway. Of course, I mean, the object doesn't exist. It doesn't make sense to try to find a property on an object that doesn't exist, okay? Like, of course, if book, and this expression means, remember, the truthy and falsy we saw last time. Truthy and falsy means, I mean, the object is truthy if the reference points to some object, even an empty object, okay? So if this evaluates to true, it means the book is something that can be used in this notation, okay? If book.author, and I mean, this is not an error in JavaScript if author is undefined, okay? It's just an error if book is undefined, okay? If author is undefined, well, the expression simply evaluates to false and you don't enter the if, okay? So, differently from other languages where when you try to access a property, I mean, yes, a pointer, a reference that is null, okay? Here, if it's undefined, I mean, as long as you don't want to dereference it more, so with another dot and so on, I mean, it's fine for JavaScript. Okay, so let's say, in short, if you're not sure if book is defined or book author is defined and so on, you should test it before using it, okay? Otherwise, you have a runtime error. It means that JavaScript code stops running, okay? As in any other programming languages. If you have a runtime error, the execution stops, okay? In C, you have problems, maybe the operating system closes the process. In interpreted languages, the interpreter stops executing the code. And this means that if you do it in your applications, web applications, the interpreter inside the browser stops the execution of the code. So the application might stop working, okay? Because the rest of the code is not executed. It doesn't define functions, respond to events, and so on. It depends where the error happens, okay? So make sure that you always catch these kind of errors. Since it's so common to have these situations, there is even a shorter version of this way of testing the content of variables with the double AND, okay? You remember we saw the double vertical bars, that is the logical OR, and the logical AND here, it means Evaluate the right expression only if the left expression is true, okay? Otherwise, you get the value of the left expression, okay? Good, so it's a shorter way of writing the same code as above, okay? Sometimes it's very, very convenient to make the code more readable, okay? For JavaScript, I mean, it's the same, actually. How do we iterate over properties? You remember we saw for off and for in? Well, the for in iterates over properties, but you need to have an object. It doesn't make sense to use it over an array, okay? Don't use it over an array, because arrays are objects. They have properties, but they are not the elements of the array, okay? So, object, very simple object, defined here immediately, so it's easy to read. Okay, two properties, x and y, and iterates over the keys, okay? So the properties inside the object. If you want the value, well, you just use an expression with the square brackets, right? You have the object reference, you have the square bracket, you have the key, you use it, okay? So it's like writing, in this case, well, actually, in this case, you don't have the reference to the object because you define it immediately here in the for, okay? You should define outside, have a reference, and then you can access the values. But here you define book outside. You see you have authors and Enrico pages 340, and so you can do this operation. In book, prop is a key, and so you can print prop and book props, okay? Accessing the value of the property. Okay, I wanted to say something. Const, okay? You might see const, okay? Why it works? Because at every cycle, the prop is recreated, okay? And in general, it's a good rule, even though, I mean, we don't want to really strictly enforce it, to define everything that we don't need to modify as const in JavaScript. Why? Because it's easier to catch errors, okay? Because when the parser reads the code, if we assign something to a const variable, it tells us there's a problem, even before starting execution. So, you know, it's much easier to catch errors. Maybe we can try this code in Python Tutor just to practice it a little bit, okay? Copy and paste. So Python Tutor, okay. Just copy pasting. I mean, visualize execution. Hopefully with not too many adds. I never know what comes out. And you see, from line 1 to line 6, okay, just a definition of an object, so there's not so much to execute inside the lines between 1 and 6, okay, just a definition. So that's the global frame, means the global memory. You have a book variable, okay, it's a reference to an object that contains 3 properties, author, pages, chapter, and you see the value on the right, and the third is an array, which is immediately defined there, okay? So it's somewhere in the memory, it's being created by JavaScript, and here in chapter pages you have a reference to the array, okay? And then you can cycle, okay, in the for, const prop in block 1 means it's inside in nested scope. So, okay, prop gets the first value, okay, of the key in the array, and prop is author, and so book prop will be Enrico, okay, so the value that corresponds to the prop. And here is the console, okay, where you print the result, okay. You might notice the template literal. Remember how we can define strings, single quote, double quote, so this backticks, and the backticks allows us to include this $sign and so on to evaluate the JavaScript expression, much more convenient than the rest, okay? And JavaScript expression can be anything, right? So even accessing a property and so on, okay? And so you test the rest of the code, okay? Oh, why it prints the whole array? Well, just because inside JavaScript there are convenience methods, okay, in the standard library And if you do console log of a reference to array, it goes through the array and then prints the whole array in the format that the library wants, okay? The interpreter actually wants. Okay, that's why it works. Okay, sometimes it's convenient, sometimes might not be so convenient, depending on the occasions. Okay, just experiment with this. Okay, so we tested some code coming from the slides. Of course, in a very simple setting. In the second part of the lecture, we will use an environment like the Visual Studio Code, and so we start to be a little bit more professional for bigger projects. Okay, even though the things we see are simple. Okay, so iterating over properties, the for is one way. There are other ways. Of course, here in the slides, you have some highlights only of the things we believe they can be useful for you for later, okay? Of course, we have 2 years of history of this course, so more or less we know what is useful. Yes, that's a question? Yeah?
Can I redefine it if I would like to print in another way?
I think so. It's not covered in this course, yes. So yeah, basically there should be a method, I don't remember, if something like toString or something like this. You can have a look if in case you like it, you go to MDN as we did last time, array, okay? So the Mozilla Developer Network, there is probably some toString, yes, it's predefined, so every array has it. Yeah, I think you can do the array .toString equal to something, and so you can put your function there. But I mean, yeah, it's a bit difficult to do this kind of things because you know the way in which JavaScript handles object, so the reference to the object and so on. Okay, but in theory it can be done. Okay, libraries and other instruments that we might want to use to help us in development sometimes do it. Okay, for this course it's not needed. Okay. Okay, we can talk a little bit more during the break maybe if you are interested, just because, I mean, this discussion goes a little bit out of what is really needed in the course, okay, and we have so many topics to do. Okay, so keys and entries. So keys just return an array of the keys. Oh, just remember, I mean, there is no order in the keys, okay? So we had an example, it was so nice because it printed things in the order we wrote it in the code, but this is not guaranteed, okay? So it was like author, what was it? Author, pages, searchable. It's just a matter of chance, okay? It's not guaranteed because you can add, remove, and so on, and there's no order. It's not like an array where there is box number 1, 2, 3, and so on. Okay, it's lot 1, 2, 3, and so on. Okay, the array, of course, is ordered. Okay, entries gives you an array where each entry in the array is an array with just 2 positions, a key and the value. Okay, just for convenience. Okay, copying object, like copying arrays. Well, the problem is exactly the same. We are copying the reference. Okay? We are copying the reference. It means we don't have a copy of the values. So there's just a single array, a single object in this case. So book2 equal to book, it's just an alias. It's a second reference to the same object. If you really want another object, well, there are many different ways. Now we are going to see some of them, how to create a copy of the object, not doing it manually, okay? And this is one possibility, okay? There is object, is a predefined object in JavaScript, note the uppercase O, like the A for the array and so on. Dot assign and an empty object and copy over it book, okay? And the library, the standard JavaScript library, does the copy for you, okay? Of all the properties, user-defined properties actually, okay? And the situation you end up with is this one. Okay, so you might wonder how object assign works. There's a target, there's a source, and there's even other parameters, okay? So assign all the properties from the source, so from the right to the left, okay? From source to target. And target can be anything, can be an existing object, so it overrides properties, already existing properties, or can be an empty object. Very simple to create an empty object. Open and close curly brackets, okay? Like the array, open and close square brackets. If properties already exist, are overwritten, and returns the target object after the modification. Okay, so you define a new object, but you don't have a reference if you define it like this. But luckily, the function returns the reference to this target object. So that's why this expression works, because the return value is actually this object fully filled in with the book properties. Okay? Okay, good. Beware, again, shallow copy only if there are references inside the object, like study is an object you see from the curly bracket, and source is book, so a reference to another object, another array, and so on. The other, the object assigned, of course, copy the reference. So study2, you see it's another object, JavaScript, but the reference to the secondary object, so Enrico 340, is the same. You see the two arrows goes in the same place. Okay? If you have any doubt, questions, and so on, just try the code in Python Tutor. So easy, so nice to visualize things. Okay? So the upper part is before the copy, and the lower part after the copy. Actually, here we start seeing something about functions, but we'll talk about functions more in a few minutes. In JavaScript, you can have functions with variable number of parameters. Okay, so what we saw before is just using 2 parameters. There can be other sources, so you can even copy more properties from other objects and so on. Okay, that's the way in which the standard assigned function is defined on objects in JavaScript. Okay. Okay, so you see here with 3 examples. So that's the empty object. We add a property title, JavaScript, and all the other properties. Okay, that's probably the most common pattern. Like we want a copy of the object, but in addition we want to add the property. Okay, instead of doing it afterward, book2.title equal to JS. It's possible. Okay, but I already told you in the first lecture. You know, JavaScript programmers like to compact the way in which they write code. Okay, so the less you write, they think the better it is, which is sometimes not so easy for readability, but I think you get used to it, and there's quite a good logic behind it. So, I mean, there are, let's say, common programming patterns that are easy to recognize like this. So, I mean, it's better to get used to them. Okay. And of course, as in any other programming language, you can write very cryptic code, okay, but we don't aim to that direction, at that direction. Okay, you can even copy with a spread operator. You remember the 3 dots for the array? Very common way of copying arrays, especially when they are small, like in our programs. This is not really ES6. You remember we targeted ES6, the version of the language. This is ES9, so it was introduced in 2011 for objects. Okay, arrays were already in ES6. What does it imply for us? Well, actually nothing. We can use it just because we are using an interpreter node in standalone mode when we have the server, which understands ES9, ES10, ES11, and so on until the latest version of JavaScript, so no problem for that. And in the browser, we will use a framework that, in case it's needed, it translates this code in something that is suitable for the browser. Okay, modern browser typically goes beyond the ES6, but I mean, we don't have to really care because there's a step between us and the browser when we are using React and the framework that helps us to put everything together that will do the translation for us. So in short, that means even if it's a modern feature, like not ES6, but a bit more modern, more recent, we can use it, okay? Because somebody will take care of make everything work, even though it's not really already supported in the environment of the browser, okay? So in short, we can use it also for objects. And what's the syntax? Well, it's very similar, right? 3 dots, the old object, and you get the new object, okay? Again, shallow copy only, okay? So everything is copied. If it's a reference, just copy the reference. Okay, you can experiment with it a little bit. You can even do the tricks that we did in the arrays. Okay, so use it on the left side of the equal sign of the assignment. And so A, B, and the rest is assigned, here it's just in the creation of the object, so not really the left side, okay? So here it's spread, okay, that's why it's called it this way. So it takes orders, enumerate the properties, and make each single property available as a single property in the new object, okay? Okay, we don't have any different example here. Okay, good. Okay, check if a property exists. Well, actually, the in operator can be used for this. So you might wonder if an object has a certain property. Typically, an object that you didn't create, but maybe a library created for you, and you want to know if something is present or not. Okay? So if, author in, or P in math, okay. Author in book, yes, true, okay. So this is a Boolean expression, of course, it's just true, false, okay. If you print it, it prints true or false. You delete it, and it's not there anymore. Make sure, you just don't do author equal undefined. You can write it, author equal undefined, author equal to null, and so on, but it's not the same. The property still exists, it's just another value. Okay? If you want to delete it, the only way you have is the delete keyword, okay? The delete operator of the JavaScript language. Okay, this is sort of technicalities, let's say, okay? So let's summarize what we saw in the objects. Objects can be created simply by opening a curly bracket and eventually writing some properties directly there, okay? And of course, you need to assign it to something if you want to have a reference to that object, okay? Empty object, very easy. New object, that's another way. Not so much used, I must say, because, this syntax is so easy to read and to write, so that everybody basically use it. And there is even a static method of the object inside the JavaScript library, to which you can pass anything you like. Typically another object to create a new object, okay? And the constructor function, that's the last topic of the slides. Just in case you're really a big fan of this object-oriented programming paradigm, just creating objects with new is particularly simple in JavaScript, so we are going to see just an example, just to let you know that there is this possibility. But since we don't have templates, we don't have private properties and so on, it's up to you to decide if you want to use it or not. Okay, what means static method? Static method is a bit strange word here, right? We say that, classes don't exist. Classes have static methods, right? So basically, it's just a method like any other method in JavaScript, but in the predefined object available from the JavaScript environment, there are properties that basically are the same for all the objects that will be created inside the environment. So that's why we call it static method, because unless we change it, we know it's the same for all the objects we create, okay? But, if we want to make a comparison with traditional object-oriented programming paradigm, of course, static method means it's a method defined on the class and not on the object, okay? And the concept is very similar here. It's the same. It's already available to everybody creating an object in any part of the JavaScript code. Okay, so is everything clear? You should pause a little bit. I don't think, you already have programming knowledge, even object-oriented programming knowledge, so this thing should be quite easy to understand once you practice a little bit, okay? The objective of the next lab, next week, will be, setting up the environment and everything, and then practice a little bit, programming a little bit in JavaScript. Very simple. If you already know how to program in JavaScript, there's no point in coming to the labs to say, but just make sure you use your time in the most effective ways as possible, okay? at least for these simple things, I mean, they are easy to experiment by yourself. Functions. Functions are very, very important. We will stay on functions, and especially we will use functions a lot in this course and in the rest of the course in JavaScript in general. So we need to really understand well this aspect, okay? Because they are one of the most important elements in JavaScript. They are very important because they define a behavior. So you can write code inside the function. So you can attach code, means behavior, to what's happening inside your web application. It means react to events, okay? React, not the framework, but I mean, do something when an event happens in the browser. And also, it's the classical way of defining a scope inside JavaScript, okay? Defining a scope is not just opening a curly bracket, like in C, in Java, and so on, but it's, it creates a private scope, okay, in JavaScript. And actually, that's the only way to create a private scope in JavaScript. Define a new function and write code inside the function, okay? And sometimes it can be convenient. We will see it in a few minutes. Of course, there are functions, so accept parameters, give a return value, and so on. Traditional concept of the functions, okay? But functions themselves are objects in JavaScript. It means that they have a reference. They can be assigned to variables. They can be passed as a return value from functions, and so on. Whatever you want. Put into arrays, in objects, into properties of objects, so this property for us becomes a sort of method, and so on, okay? They can be passed as an argument, and so on, okay? Other languages support it, but probably JavaScript supports it in a way which is the most useful and the one that has the largest extent, okay? You have a function pointers in C, for instance, but they're not so easy to use, right? And you need to remember types and so on. You might have similar things in other languages, but here the concept is really brought to the extreme case, okay? So it can be used as a value as any other value. And this has some consequences, like the closures that we are going to talk in a few minutes. So how you define a function? Well, that's a keyword, function. Okay, so the simplest way. Function, something, you give a name, like in any other language. You define a set of parameters, you open the curly bracket, and you write code, okay? And of course, you return some value at a certain point if you like. So, classic functions, function square, very simple stuff, like, first year university course. Let y equal to x times x, return y, that makes the square of the number you pass. So let n square 4, and means 16, and that's all, okay? You call it with a name, as you do in other languages. I mean, the different thing is that you don't define a type for x. So what happens if you pass a string? I don't know. It depends on the value of this expression. If it gives you a runtime error, probably yes. Not really sure. I think yes. The star operator is not the final string, so probably it gives a runtime error. So you don't define types, neither for the parameters nor for the return value, okay? It's an interpreted language, and the type is associated to values and not the variables, okay? So during the execution, this is the visualization of Python 2. That's much less useful here because, I mean, the object is a function, so the content of the object that is sort of type function is just the code of the function. So, I mean, not so useful. You cannot just play with this code, okay? You can create another function, it's another function, and you cannot just go and modify the code. Okay, parameters, comma, separated list of parameter names. You might have a default value. Some of you likes it. I mean, not really so useful in our case, but I mean, just in case. Parameters are passed by value. It means everything is passed by value, and it's easy for number strings, and when you have objects, it means the reference is passed, okay? Not a copy of the full object array and so on, okay? It's like pointers in C. copy of the reference to the object. Parameters that are not passed in the function call get the value undefined. This is pretty peculiar, right? So you define a function with 3 parameters, you can call it with 1. It's not an error, okay? The other 2 gets undefined as a value when you execute the function body, okay? So, and of course you can check if the value is undefined and do something and react. And of course the function must be written in a way that it expects this condition. But if you want the functions with a variable number of parameters, for instance, this is a possibility, right? We saw it before, object assign. It can take 1 parameter, 2 parameters, 3 parameters, and so on, okay? If the other are not passed, the function body, the code, will check it and we see, well, it's undefined. Okay, I don't have anything to copy. Okay, that's all. I just returned the first parameter. Okay, and you have a way to check if the value of a variable is undefined. Very simple, okay? Undefined is a keyword in JavaScript, and with the triple equal, you can check it in an if or whatever expression, okay? You can even have a variable number of parameters, okay? Like the printf in C. You know, the printf in C, you can put so many parameters as you like. As many parameters as you like. And how do we do it here? Well, with these 3 dots again. Here it's called rest and not spread, but it's just a name, okay? I mean, it says all the rest, that's probably where the name comes from, is put here. And of course, since it's a variable number of parameters, it must be treated as an array. So you can iterate over the array, and you can do it with the classical for or with the for off that you have in JavaScript, okay? For I equal to 0, I minus, I less than something, I plus plus, up to the length, okay? Or there is this for off that automatically iterates over all the elements of the array, okay? So you can even define your functions with a variable number of parameters. But, I mean, this is, I would say, a bit peculiar example, okay? Okay, so function do, one way of defining function. Other way, function without a name, but to be useful, of course, you need to have a reference to this function, but because at a certain point you want to call the function. And so you can assign it to a variable, okay? We say it's an object that can be assigned to anywhere and can be treated as any other reference to object. So here you assign it to fn, which is just a variable that we just defined here, okay? Typically const because you don't want to redefine it, just not to mess up with your code, okay? But it's not strictly required here. So, of course, without the fn, you can even write function something without the do, without the name, but then you cannot call it, so it's useless, right? Or fn equal to function do, but I mean, in this case, do is not used, okay? Because, you can use it if you want to call it without the fn, but it's just a duplicate, right? So this is not a syntax error, and that's all we wanted to say. Okay, so function square, cube, function C, cube, we call square, okay, and we return a value, okay, very simple. Yeah, you see that the functions becomes visible in the rest of the code, okay? So basically you can use it as other functions already defined in your code, okay? Okay, you can store the value, here, let cube, okay? You can store the value function C in a cube and call it, okay? How do you call it? You take the name of the variable and you pass a parameter. Open the round bracket and call it, okay? Very simple. And here it's what we said, okay, if it's a reference to a function is stored into a variable, we are used to call it a method in case it's a property of an object, okay? If it's just a variable in your code, probably we call it function, okay? It's still function. If you pass it as a parameter to a function, we will use this terminology that It's used in other languages as well. So it's still a function. Nothing has changed, but we typically call it callback. So it's a function that has to be called back to the function to which we pass it. Okay? And we will do it so many times here in JavaScript in the rest of this course because JavaScript works in this way. It's really asynchronous, and we will see what this means later. And so you tell a function to do something, and you pass a function to be called when this function has finished the work. Okay? And so it will be called back just to tell you, okay, I finished, and now I do something else. Okay? But again, we will come back to this point. Last way of defining a function is the arrow function. Very, very common idiom in JavaScript. Okay, this arrow, and the arrow actually is not a real arrow. It's just equal and greater than sign. Okay, just two characters. You define a set of parameters, and of course you have a block of code where you can write your code. Okay, and since it has no name, no possibility to give a name to this syntax, function name, you need to assign it to something, so to a variable, or just use it where you need it. If you need to pass it to a function, you just write it as a value for the parameters when you call the function. Okay? We will see plenty of examples of this way of writing functions. Okay? So let's come to the example we saw before, fourth power of something. Okay? Wrote in a way using the arrow function syntax. X return square x times square x. Okay? So return, and of course you put a JavaScript expression. Fourth, it means, okay, we call square, so 16 times 16 and 264 and so on. Okay? A fourth way, a fourth way of defining a function. Okay? Even more, arrow functions are even more flexible. And I told you, JavaScript likes be very, to write the least possible amount of code sometimes. Okay? So you can define functions in very cryptic ways, okay? Like without using the brackets, if you just have one single parameter. Just with the arrow function syntax, okay? If you use the arrow function syntax, you just write the parameter, and then arrow, and then what you want to do. And here as well, you will be able to short it even more, okay? If you have no parameters, of course, you need to tell there is no parameters, so empty brackets, round brackets, okay? Of course, the syntax we saw before is valid, it's the traditional one. If you have more than one parameter, it's mandatory that you use the brackets, okay? You can have default values in case very, very rare occurrence. Return value. Any JavaScript function returns something, so all JavaScript functions return something which is undefined unless you say something else, okay? You can omit the return statement, and there's no syntax error, no problem, but the return value is undefined, okay? So if you use it somewhere, it is undefined. Just, you need to know it, okay? If you want to return a value, you need to write return something, unless you have the arrow function, and we will see it in a minute. Only one value can be returned, okay? So you cannot just return two values. Yes?
Does it result in a complete crash of the application, the return, because it's undefined?
No. Undefined is a valid value in JavaScript. So unless you dereference like dot something or do some operations, undefined is perfectly valid value in JavaScript. So you can fill up an array with undefined values, everything is fine, okay? You can have an object with many properties, all undefined, is perfectly fine, okay? As long as in your code you don't try to use undefined in a way which is forbidden, like dot something, for instance, okay? So you just need to keep in mind this, because sometimes, since the environment doesn't give you an error, you write a function, you forget the return, like before. I mean, of course, we wanted to return something, the value of the computation, right? You don't return it, you print it, and it comes out undefined. Okay, I forgot the return somewhere. But if that was supposed to be an object, then I do dot something, and of course, it creates an error, a runtime error, okay? But, I mean, only one value can be returned, but since JavaScript is so flexible, you can return anything. You can return an array, you can return an object, you can even return a function, or a mix of this, or in addition to number, strings, Boolean, okay, the traditional basic types, okay? And so it's perfectly fine to do that. And even remember that we saw that the structuring assignment. So we can even assign everything you return like in an array with a single instruction. You see this function, arrow function, takes 0 parameters, return an array, 2 elements, and you can assign the returned array directly to different variables defined on the fly here, str and num, okay, number. So we don't care about the array, we care about str and num, and so in the rest of the code we can use str and num, and indeed we can write console log str, this will evaluate to hello, and console log num, and it will evaluate to 5, okay? Everything is done automatically by JavaScript, so quite compact code, and the limitation that you can return just one value is not really a big limitation. Actually, it's no limitation, because when you want to return more than one value, you just return an array. That's all, okay? And you can even assign the values automatically with a single instruction. Just be careful, this arrow functions have an implicit return value if there is only one value. So before we wrote x, return square times square, return with the curly brackets, okay? And the most compact way of writing that arrow function is x without the brackets, because it's just one single parameter, and then automatically have a return value because the body of the function is a JavaScript expression, okay? Square x times square x, okay? That has a value, and that will become automatically the return value. This only works with the arrow functions, okay? If you write function something and so on, it doesn't work, okay? If you open the curly bracket, the return statement is mandatory, okay? You write a square times square, it doesn't work, okay? Because the return value with the square bracket is just the one that you pass to the return statement, to the return keyword, okay? So if you miss return here, you print it, the value is undefined, okay? Just experiment with this a little bit. Nested functions, oh, this becomes interesting, okay? Nested functions are functions that can be defined inside another function, okay? Very important in JavaScript, and quite unusual in other programming languages, right? But here it's perfectly fine, and it will have a lot of consequences, but also a lot of potentiality, or a lot of things you can do. So, function, hypotenuse, so you want to compute the side of a triangle, AB, with the famous theorem, square A, square B, the square root, and so on, okay? And you define square here inside the other function. Okay? Something which is perfectly possible. It works very well in JavaScript. Okay? The only thing you need to remember is that, square is just any other variable defined into an inner scope is not visible outside. Okay? So square here is not visible outside the function code. Okay? But like any other variable that we define inside, let A, let B, and so on, it's scoped inside the code of the function. Okay? But if a function is made available outside this scope, what happens? Okay? You have a function square here. Let's say instead of returning the number, you return the function. You know, in JavaScript, you can return the function. What happens to what it was accessible to the function inside the scope of the outside function? That's the main point to address in JavaScript. And this is the concept of the closure. This is the definition, but we will see an example. It's pretty impossible to understand, at least the first time reading this definition. A closure is a name given to a feature in the language, JavaScript language, by which a nested function, like the one before, executed after the execution of the other function can still access other functions' scope. Okay, so all the variables, including parameters that were available to the function inside. Okay, of course, it's pretty cryptic. Difficult to understand. Let's see an example, a better example. Okay, so we have a function greeter, just to say hello. Okay, to somebody whose name is passed as a parameter. Okay, name. So we expect a string here, and we define a function, hello function. 0 parameter, just return hello plus the name, okay? And this is return outside. So this function is true that it can be accessed, called immediately only inside the function, okay? But if I pass it outside with a return statement, it's a reference to a function. So the function still exists, okay? So it can be used. It can be called, okay? So greeter Tom returns a function reference that is stored in hello Tom. Okay? And so if you write hello Tom with the brackets, you call this function. But the point now is what is the name that the function uses for my name? Okay? Is it a name that is currently available? Where is it still available? Is it an error? What's happening? Well, what's happening is that basically the function remembers the scope where it is defined. So here, even after the external function is no longer active. So greeter has been called before, it's finished the execution. Okay? So, the my name cannot be directly accessed by the rest of the code. You cannot write my name something here because it's not available. It's a syntax error. Okay? But the function that was defined when the my name was available in the scope still has access to that content. Okay? And so if you call it hello Tom, this hello Tom will return hello plus the my name that has the value that was available when the function was created. Okay? In this first case, it will print, of course, hello Tom, and in the second case, hello Jerry. Okay? So there are two my name variables, okay, that are not accessible here in the global scope. You cannot write my name here because it's an error, but the functions, the reference to the functions that you got, are able to access them, okay? And automatically, this is done automatically by JavaScript, okay? And this is what is called closure, because the value is available, but it's closed inside the function, okay? Only that function with its code can access that value. And also in this case, in this way, we were able to do closing a value, the accessibility of a value. So in short, we sort of created a private variable, okay, only accessible to some function. This is just a comment, okay. So this is the basic concept demonstrating closures, okay. And we will have closures everywhere in JavaScript, okay. Sometimes at the exam, let's say I want to give 30 with the laude to somebody. I ask often, well, how can this function can access this variable? Okay, and typically the answer is because there is a closure, and the closure happens here. Okay, because it's full of closures. Every time you write a function for handling an event, it creates a lot of closures. Everything which is available when you define the function and the event didn't happen, becomes a closure when the event happens, okay? Because it's available, yes? No. Indeed, this is something in addition. Just to make clear, I mean, this was a variable that is available in the scope of the outer function, okay? So it works also if we were just write name, but it's less obvious, right? Because, I mean, we should add that even the parameters of a function becomes part of the closure when you define a function inside, okay? So it works even if we just have name, but the function hello plus name, okay? Because even that parameter becomes a part of the closure because it's part of the scope of the outside function, okay? Thank you for the question. Okay, so many closures happening inside normal code in JavaScript for web applications, okay? Okay, so this is the whole explanation in writing, okay? So each of the functions remembers the reference to my name when it was defined. So in short, there are multiple instances of this my name in the memory of JavaScript somewhere, and only those functions can access actually the right instance of that value, okay? It can even modify that value. Sometimes not so useful because, you know, things can get complicated, but I mean, in very simple cases, we'll see an example, you can even modify it, and so you have a variable which is accessible actually only from the function that created a closure on it, okay? So, in this way, you have a very powerful system to emulate object-oriented programming. You know, the concept of object-oriented programming is to encapsulate properties and make sure that only methods that you allow can modify those properties, okay, when you have objects with private properties. And actually, if you create a function, you have a value inside, you have methods that can act on those values, you return the methods, the functions actually, we call them methods because we are in object state, let's say. And you return the function, and the function will act on this value, okay? And so if you do counter, you get a reference to a function, you can call it, okay, with the round brackets. And so this value will become 1, 2, 3, because you do plus, plus, right? And you return the value. So you can use that value, okay? Just a number. If it's a anything can be passed in JavaScript, just you cannot pass the whole objects, arrays, and so on, you pass the reference. Or if it's a primitive type, string, number, boolean, and so on, you can just obviously copy the value. So you get 1, 2, 3, and then you call counter again, and you get again 1, 2, 3, because counter creates another instance of value. Every time you call counter, you create a new scope, right? So there is a new scope, a new instance of the value variable, okay? So there are two different values here. If you do count 2 again, you will get 4, 5, etc. If you, at a certain point, you do count 2, you restart from 3, because there are two different values, okay? You can just practice. Remember, you can return whatever you want. You can return a set of methods, okay? A set means in JavaScript an object. You open the curly bracket and you return two properties that have as values functions. These functions are here inside the counter, so they have the possibility to access n, okay? N++, n 0, and so on. You can even store values and so on. You can access the variables, so you can do whatever you want, okay? So count, first time 0, it returns the value because it returns and then increment, okay? Okay, so that's why first time is 0. They count 0, they count independently. C reset, okay? So C count is still 0. It was 1 because we had plus plus, but then we have n0, okay? Okay, and then decount there we didn't reset anything, so we get 1, and then plus plus inside the n value there is 2. Okay. And this possibility creates a lot of idioms in JavaScript where you can basically just create a function just to hide some value somewhere, okay? And you can even immediately call that function, okay? You just put round brackets around your function definition. Remember, function definition is an expression. It's a reference to the function. You put brackets around. You put brackets here with the parameters that the function expects, and you can immediately call it. Of course, I mean, this is might not be so useful because you don't have an handle to this function, so you can use, you can call it just once, okay? But if you want to hide, let's say, a big piece of code, you can do it. You can nest functions as much as you like, okay? So typically, a way to isolate your code from the rest of the code in JavaScript could be to use this immediately invoked function expression. You put all your code inside a function without parameters, put brackets, call it without parameters, you close it, okay? Everything becomes a closure, okay? But I mean, this is just the technical stuff, and often libraries do this operation to avoid that you can interfere with their values, okay? And that's why we name it. It's very unusual that we find code like this in your code, okay? Okay, so just last slide, okay? I told you, some of you might like, you know, using a sort of object-oriented programming style. We already saw this new, I told you, we can create objects with a new keyword, and you can even define sort of constructors with to be used with this new, like in traditional object-oriented programming languages. And how do you do this? Well, actually, you define standard, normal functions just for our convenience. I mean, not JavaScript convenience. It's not mandatory, but use the capital letter for the function. So you just remember that it has been like defined as a constructor function. And then if you call it with the new, it will return an object. And you can set the properties of that object inside the function using the keyword this. Okay? Very similar to traditional object-oriented programming languages that often has this keyword. So you want to define a car, certain make, model, year, etc., and some methods. Well, this dot, etc., and you assign values or even functions, as we said. Okay? Functions that can use whatever you want, okay, that is available in the scope of the constructor function. So, by the way, we are creating a closure over here, okay? When we will use isNew, we call this function isNew afterwards, okay? The function has a closure over here, okay, the variable here. And just be careful, you need to remember to call it with the new keyword. If you call it without a new keyword, it doesn't work, okay? Because, I mean, that's the way JavaScript has been designed in the past. I told you it was being designed in 10 days. A lot of decisions were taken probably too fast or without thinking too much, just thinking of what I need tomorrow, okay? And so, you know, this syntax is in the middle between traditional object-oriented programming languages and actual not object-oriented programming languages, because you have the this, you have the new, but you don't have the classes, right? So a bit strange. Okay, but sometimes it might be useful. I think in the first lab, even in the second, we have some solution that we will provide to you that use it. But just to practice it a little bit, okay? Because sometimes you find it around, okay? People seems they cannot live without constructor functions, okay? Okay, so in case you have questions, I'm glad to answer you. Otherwise, maybe we can have a 10 minutes break, something like this. and I will prepare the environment, Visual Studio Code and so on, and we will play a little bit, since some of you like not to make not to have the break, okay? I'm just joking, but I mean, we already have an exercise in the material course, lecture example, sorry. Lecture example, there's, no, not this README. The week 01 README exercises, okay? We will try to solve some of these exercises in the next 1 hour and a half, a bit less. Okay, thank you. Have a nice break.